Let me share something powerful with you today that could completely transform how you handle relationships and emotional attachments. We're going to talk about 5 fundamental rules for emotional detachment, something that most people never learn to master. You know what's fascinating? Most people spend their entire lives in emotional bondage without even realizing it. They're so tangled up in other people's lives, so wrapped up in other people's emotions that they've lost themselves completely. Let me tell you about something I learned early in my career that changed everything for me. My mentor said, "Jim, your emotional freedom is more valuable than any relationship." Now, isn't that interesting? Most people have this backwards. They sacrifice their emotional freedom to maintain relationships that aren't serving them. Let's dive into these 5 rules that could transform your life. The first rule is what I call the recognition rule. You must recognize where you end and where others begin. You must understand that you are not responsible for other people's emotions and they are not responsible for yours. Think about that for a moment. How many times have you taken responsibility for someone else's happiness? How many times have you blamed others for your emotional state? That's not emotional freedom, that's emotional bondage. Here's what's fascinating about this first rule. Most people never learn it. They go through life in a constant state of emotional entanglement, never understanding where their emotions end and where others begin. Let me share with you what I call the emotional boundary test. Ask yourself, can I be happy when this person is sad? Can I be at peace when this person is troubled? Can I be calm when this person is chaotic? If the answer is no, you haven't established proper emotional boundaries. The second rule is what I call the release rule. You must learn to let go of the need to control others' emotions or reactions. You must release your attachment to how others feel about you, think about you, or respond to you. Now, isn't that interesting? Most people spend their entire lives trying to control how others feel about them. They twist themselves into emotional pretzels trying to manage other people's reactions. But here's the truth, you can't control how others feel, and trying to do so only creates more emotional bondage. Let me tell you about something I call the control paradox. The more you try to control others' emotions, the less control you have over your own. The more you try to manage others' reactions, the more reactive you become yourself. The third rule is what I call the responsibility rule. You must take full responsibility for your own emotional state. Not partial responsibility, full responsibility. Not sometimes, all the time. Not when it's convenient, even when it's challenging. Think about this. Every time you blame someone else for how you feel, you give away your power to change how you feel. Every time you make someone else responsible for your emotional state, you become a prisoner to their choices and actions. Let me share with you what I call the emotional responsibility formula. Your emotions, your thoughts, your choices, your responses, your. Notice what's not in this formula? Other people's actions, words, or behaviors. The fourth rule is what I call the distance rule. You must create emotional distance without creating emotional walls. You must learn to care without carrying, to love without losing yourself, to be involved without being entangled. Here's what's fascinating about this rule. Most people think emotional detachment means not caring at all. But that's not it. Emotional detachment means caring while maintaining your emotional freedom. It means loving without becoming emotionally dependent. Let me tell you about something I call the distance principle. The healthier your emotional boundaries, the closer you can actually get to people without losing yourself. The more emotionally detached you are, the more genuinely connected you can become. The fifth rule is what I call the self-focus rule. You must keep the spotlight of your attention on your own growth, your own journey, your own emotional well-being. Not occasionally, consistently, not when it's easy, especially when it's difficult. Think about it. How can you possibly maintain emotional detachment if you're constantly focused on someone else's emotional state? How can you maintain your emotional freedom if your attention is always on others? Let me share with you what I call the 3 levels of emotional detachment. The first level is physical detachment, creating actual physical space when needed. The second level is mental detachment, redirecting your thoughts and attention. The third level is emotional detachment, maintaining your emotional independence while still caring. Now, here's what's interesting about these levels. Most people try to achieve emotional detachment without first mastering physical and mental detachment. But it's like trying to run before you can walk. Each level builds on the previous one. Let me tell you about something I call the detachment development process. First, you create physical space when needed. Then you learn to redirect your thoughts. Finally, you develop emotional independence. Each step is crucial and none can be skipped. Think about this process like learning to swim. First, you learn to float. That's physical detachment. Then you learn to tread water. That's mental detachment. Finally, you learn to swim freely. That's emotional detachment. Here's another fascinating aspect of emotional detachment. It actually allows for deeper, more authentic connections. When you're not emotionally dependent on others, you can choose to connect from a place of freedom rather than need. Let me share with you what I call the 4 freedoms of emotional detachment. The first freedom is the freedom to care without carrying. The second freedom is the freedom to love without losing yourself. The third freedom is the freedom to help without becoming helpless. The fourth freedom is the freedom to connect without becoming dependent. But here's what's interesting about these freedoms. They only come after you've mastered the 5 rules we've discussed. You can't experience these freedoms while you're still emotionally entangled. Think about it. How many relationships in your life are based on emotional dependency rather than emotional freedom? How many connections are maintained through emotional entanglement rather than conscious choice? Let me tell you about something I call the emotional detachment test. Ask yourself, can I be completely okay regardless of what this person does, says, or feels? If the answer is no, you still have work to do on your emotional detachment. Now, here's another powerful aspect of emotional detachment. It gives you incredible clarity. When you're not emotionally entangled with others, you can see situations and relationships much more clearly. Let me share with you what I call the 3 clarities of emotional detachment. The first clarity is seeing relationships as they are, not as you wish they were. The second clarity is seeing others as they are, not as you need them to be. The third clarity is seeing yourself as you are, not as others want you to be. Think about these clarities. Really let them sink in, because once you have them, your relationships transform completely. You no longer operate from emotional need or dependency. You operate from emotional freedom and choice. Here's another fascinating thing about emotional detachment. It actually makes you more valuable in relationships. When you're not emotionally dependent, when you're not emotionally needy, you bring a strength to relationships that most people never develop. Let me tell you about what I call the detachment paradox. The more emotionally detached you become, the more genuinely connected you can be. The more emotionally independent you are, the more authentic your relationships become. But here's what's interesting. Most people never experience this paradox because they're too afraid to let go of their emotional attachments. They're too comfortable in their emotional dependency to develop emotional freedom. Let me share with you what I call the 5 signs of successful emotional detachment. The first sign is being able to care without being consumed. The second sign is being able to help without being hurt. The third sign is being able to love without being lost. The fourth sign is being able to give without being depleted. The fifth sign is being able to connect without being controlled. Think about these signs. They're not just theoretical concepts, they're practical indicators of your progress in developing emotional detachment. Here's another powerful aspect of emotional detachment. It gives you unprecedented emotional stability. When your emotional state isn't dependent on others, you develop a kind of emotional steadiness that most people never achieve. Let me tell you about something I call the emotional stability formula. Your stability, your detachment, your self-awareness, your emotional responsibility. Notice that this formula doesn't include other people's actions or reactions. But here's what's fascinating. Most people never develop this stability because they're too invested in other people's emotional states. They're too entangled in other people's lives to develop their own emotional stability. Let me share with you what I call the 3 promises of emotional detachment. The first promise is freedom, freedom from emotional dependency. The second promise is clarity, clarity in all your relationships. The third promise is peace, peace regardless of what others do or say. Think about these promises. When you truly master emotional detachment, these aren't just nice ideas, they become your daily reality. Remember, emotional detachment isn't about not caring, it's about caring while maintaining your emotional freedom. It's not about building walls, it's about establishing healthy boundaries. It's not about becoming cold, it's about becoming clear. That's the message. That's the truth. That's the transformation that's possible when you master these 5 rules of emotional detachment. The choice is yours. The time is now. Will you begin your journey toward emotional freedom? Let me share something else with you about these rules of emotional detachment. You know what's fascinating? The deeper you go into this practice, the more you discover about yourself and your patterns of emotional attachment. Here's what I call the 7 layers of emotional attachment. The first layer is physical attachment, needing someone's presence. The second layer is mental attachment, constantly thinking about someone. The third layer is emotional attachment, depending on someone for your emotional state. The fourth layer is identity attachment, defining yourself through someone else. The fifth layer is security attachment, relying on someone for your sense of safety. The sixth layer is worth attachment, deriving your value from someone's opinion. And the seventh layer is purpose attachment, finding your meaning through someone else. Now, isn't that interesting? Most people don't even realize how many layers of attachment they've created. They're so deeply entangled that they can't even see where one layer ends and another begins. Let me tell you about something I call the detachment discovery process. It's the process of uncovering these layers one by one, understanding them, and consciously choosing to release them. Not because you don't care, but because you choose emotional freedom. Think about this. Every layer of attachment you maintain is like a rope tying you to someone else's emotional state. The more layers, the more ropes. The more ropes, the less freedom you have to move to grow, to be yourself. Let me share with you what I call the 3 stages of emotional release. The first stage is awareness, recognizing your attachments. The second stage is acceptance, acknowledging without judgment. The third stage is action, consciously choosing to detach. But here's what's fascinating about these stages. Most people never get past the first stage. They become aware of their attachments, but are too afraid to move into acceptance and action. They see the ropes, but are too scared to untie them. Let me tell you about something I call the fear of freedom phenomenon. Most people are actually afraid of emotional freedom. They're so used to their emotional attachments that the thought of being emotionally free is terrifying. Think about it. How many times have you stayed emotionally attached to someone not because it was healthy, but because you were afraid of who you'd be without that attachment? How many times have you maintained emotional dependencies not because they served you, but because they were familiar? Here's another powerful aspect of emotional detachment. It reveals your true strength. When you're not leaning on others emotionally, you discover just how strong you really are. Let me share with you what I call the strength discovery process. As you release each layer of attachment, you uncover a corresponding layer of personal strength. As you let go of each emotional dependency, you discover a new level of emotional independence. Now, here's what's interesting about this process. The strength was always there. It was just hidden beneath the layers of attachment. It was covered up by the emotional dependencies you created. Think about this. Every time you choose emotional detachment over emotional entanglement, you're not just letting go of something, you're claiming something. You're not just releasing an attachment, you're reclaiming your power. Let me tell you about something I call the power reclamation principle. Every act of emotional detachment is actually an act of power reclamation. Every step toward emotional freedom is a step toward personal power. But here's what's fascinating. Most people never experience this reclamation because they're too afraid to let go. They're so comfortable in their emotional dependencies that they never discover their emotional strength. Let me share with you what I call the 5 truths of emotional detachment. The first truth is that attachment is a choice. The second truth is that detachment is also a choice. The third truth is your emotional state is your responsibility. The fourth truth is that others' emotional states are their responsibility. The fifth truth is that emotional freedom is always available. Think about these truths. Really let them sink in, because once you understand them, once you truly embrace them, your whole approach to relationships changes. Here's another powerful aspect of emotional detachment. It allows you to love more purely. When you're not emotionally dependent on someone, you can love them more genuinely, more authentically, more freely. Let me tell you about something I call the pure love principle. The less emotionally dependent you are, the more purely you can love. The more emotionally detached you are, the more genuinely you can care. Now, isn't that interesting? Most people think emotional detachment means loving less, but it actually means loving more purely. It means loving without the contamination of need, without the pollution of dependency. Think about it. How much of what you call love is actually emotional dependency? How much of what you call caring is actually emotional attachment? How much of what you call connection is actually emotional entanglement? Let me share with you what I call the love liberation process. First, you recognize where love ends and attachment begins. Second, you release the attachment while maintaining the love. Third, you rediscover love in its pure form. But here's what's fascinating about this process. Most people never experience it because they can't distinguish between love and attachment. They've merged the two so completely that they think releasing attachment means releasing love. Remember, emotional detachment isn't about becoming cold or distant. It's about becoming clear and free. It's not about caring less, it's about caring more purely. It's not about loving less, it's about loving more freely. That's the ultimate message. That's the final truth. That's the lasting transformation that comes from mastering emotional detachment. The choice is yours. The time is now. Will you choose emotional freedom?